Perek Vav. Perek is known as Shalosh Aratzos. Eretz Yisrael is divided into three separate lands, almost like three separate countries for purposes of Hilchos Shviis. Now we need two introductions here. One is the issue of Biur. We've talked about it several times, and we said we would come back to it. This is not the Mishnah that's going to necessarily be talking about Biur. That will be later in the Masechta. However, in order to really understand this Mishnah, we need to have some basic understanding of Biur. Biur, we're familiar with the term when we come to Pesach. We have something called Biur Chametz. We clean out or burn the chametz. We get rid of chametz. There's a mitzvah of biur peirush shvius. Now, what is biur peirush shvius? How do you get rid of them? Why do you get rid of them? The pasuk in Parshas Bahar, the parsha of Shemitah. After the Torah tells us what you can not do during Shemitah, a sefir ketzir lo siktzar ves invei nizirecha lo sivtzar sadcha lo sizmar sadcha lo sizmar chamacha lo sizmar. The four major biblical prohibitions during Shemitah, we add to that plowing, although it's not written in the pasuk. For our purposes, plowing in Shemitah is biblically prohibited. You can't seed a field. You can't prune a grapevine, you can't cut down grain, and you can't pick grapes. Okay, those are the four biblical prohibitions, and then we add to it as a biblical prohibition plowing. And then the Torah tells us, okay, it's a Shabbos, it's a Sabbath for the land, and anyone can eat from it. We're all familiar with that. Pasuk Zayin, Perakafei Pasuk Zayin then says, V'livhemtecha v'lachaya asher ba'atzecha, to the domesticated animals and to the wild animals in Eretz Yisrael, tieh kol tvuasa lechel, all of its produce shall remain for it to be eaten. Now, what does the Rebbeinu Shalom want to teach me here when it says that the wild animals and domesticated animals can eat from the peiros of Shviis? We'll get into whether you can feed your animals peiros Shviis. Can you take your dog into a field and feed them some pomegranates? We're going to leave that alone. But for right now, the Torah is teaching me a very important lesson, and this is the pasuk of Biur. Rashi comments in summary on this pasuk. Again, it's in Parshas Bahar, by Yikra Perek Chafhei pasuk Zayin. Rashi comments, Im chaya ocheles behema lo kol shekein, shemenozeha nozonoseha olecha, ma tamud lav lefhemtecha, makish behema lachai. Kol zman chaya ocheles min atzadeh, hechol lefhemtecha min abayis. Kola lachaya min atzadeh, kalei lefhemtecha min habayis. This is the rule of Biur. The Torah tells us that your domesticated animals, which you keep at home, either you keep them in a corral or you keep them inside your home, but they're domesticated animals, and wild animals who roam. The Torah is telling us here, so long as there is growth that wild animals would be able to come and eat from, you can continue to pick from the peiros shvius in a field and feed it to your domesticated animal under certain conditions. We're not going to get into those conditions right now. The point is, so long as there's still fruit growing on trees that a wild animal can come and eat from, you can feed it to that kind of fruit to your domesticated animal. if there's no longer produce that a wild animal would be able to eat from, you have to now remove the food from your house and do biur. Let's give an example to what I just said. Biur has actually a schedule. Different fruits, different produce have different times. Let's make believe. It's a make believe. Let's make believe that pomegranates stay on the trees in Eretz Yisrael until the 20th day of Av. Mashiach will be here. We'll be able to Mekayim Tois Shviis, but Mashiach will be here. Next year, Tavshin Pei Beis is Shemitah. And as we know, the pomegranates that are on the trees when Shemitah starts are not Shemitah pomegranates because they blossomed in the 6th year, therefore they're 6th year pomegranates. But the pomegranates that blossom in the 7th year, and they are on the trees until the 20th day of Av. And there is a schedule. How the schedule is set is beyond our conversation right now. There's a schedule that on the 20th day of Av, there are no longer pomegranates on the trees, so that if wild animals were running around, they would not find a pomegranate on the tree. It's just, so to speak, a way to look at things. We can leave the wild animals out for a moment. There comes a point where there is no pomegranates left on the tree. It's the 7th year. Again, it may be the 8th year. I'm only using it as an example. Perish Shviis are those that blossom in the 7th year. If you pick them in the 7th year because they're ripe, they're Perish Shviis. If you pick them in the 8th year because they ripen, then they are Perish Shviis. It depends when it blossomed, not when you pick it. So now you have a person who went into a field and he picked pomegranates. We've already talked about the fact you can't pull up your tow truck, you can't pull up your station wagon or your van to someone's field in Shemitah and pick all his pomegranates and take them home. Okay, there's a certain amount you're allowed to pick. Again, I emphasize that the same way third parties can come into your field and pick your pomegranates, the owner, quote unquote, of that field can pick pomegranates too. It's not off limits to him. He can pick pomegranates. What he can't do is, like everyone else, he can't go into his quote unquote field and collect a mass amount of pomegranates and store them in his house. Can't do that. A certain amount you can pick for yourself, your family. And then if you need more and there's more pomegranates on the tree, you're free to go out and pick again. Let's make believe now that it's 2 weeks before the 20th day of Av. Okay, it's the 6th day of Av. And somebody went into a field and picked Shemitah pomegranates. He picked an amount that's permitted to pick. He takes the pomegranates back home. He's eating them. His family's eating them. And there's still 2 pounds of pomegranates left 2 weeks later. 2 weeks later is the 20th day of Av, and it's the biur day for pomegranates, meaning that that's the scheduled date where we're allowed to assume that there are no longer any pomegranates on the trees. That's called kola lachaya min hasodeh. There's no pomegranates on the trees left for a wild animal to roam around and take. It's a schedule. Okay, so the 20th day of Av, there's no pomegranates on the trees, but you still have 2 pounds of pomegranates that have kedusha shvius in your house. You picked it perfectly legally, and you've been feeding them to yourself and to your family, and you didn't finish all of them. And now it's the 20th day of Av, and you have 2 pounds of pomegranates in your house. You're not allowed to keep them in your house. That's called the zman biur. You have to take them out of your house and be mafkir them. You have to make them hefker. And then as we'll see later in the Masechta, there is a disagreement as what happens after you make them hefker. Some say only other people can come and take the 2 pounds of pomegranates. And some say that other people, as well as the person who was mafkir them. Reuven took them out of the house. He was mafkir them on the 20th day of Av. People can take them. He can take them. That's one shita. Another shita is only third parties can take them. What's the point of biur? The point of biur is so long as there are pomegranates on the trees for everybody to collect and share in, it's Shviis, it's Shemitah, everybody's collecting freely. So that is fine. But when the point comes where there's no more pomegranates left on the trees by the schedule, and you still have 2 pounds of pomegranates in your house, and someone else has 4 pounds of pomegranates in their house, and someone has 3 pounds of pomegranates in their house, and all over Eretz Yisrael, people have legally, the pomegranates in their house are there perfectly legally. They collected them, they didn't store them, they were going to eat them with their family, but it came 20 Av, and it's still in the house. So that means that there's no pomegranates in the fields to collect, but there are people all over Eretz Yisrael that have pomegranates. But there's nothing left in the fields for people to collect. At that point in time, the Torah says, everybody now take the pomegranates out of your house, put them in front of your house, be mafkir them, so that again, everybody has a chance to collect pomegranates. We're not going to allow a situation during Shemitah where there's nothing left on the trees, but people have them in their house. They took them legitimately. They took them legally, but now there's nothing left in the fields, and we want everyone to share and pay with Shviis equally. Take them out of your house and make them hefker. You can pick them up, you can take them back. Someone else may be able to take them. Another sheet holds only other people can take them. You can't take them back. We'll get to that later in the Masech. That's the halacha of biur. Fruits, produce, for which the mitzvah of biur was not done, are prohibited to be eaten. So if a person has these 2 pounds of pomegranates in his house that he legally collected, and he just didn't get a chance to eat it. He collected 4 pounds on the 4th day of Av. He ate 2 pounds. And on 20th of Av, the biur day for pomegranates, he still has 2 pounds in his house. And he doesn't take them out of the house and make them hefker. Fruits for which the mitzvah of biur were not done are prohibited to be eaten. That's the din of biur for us right now. And so you're going to see, as we get into Shemitah, in fact, someone, as we get into the year of Shemitah, Bezrat Hashem, someone, Arthur Jacobs, sent me a label from a bottle of wine from the last Shemitah, and it's an Otzer based in wine. We're going to get into the laws of Otzer based. There's a lot of subjects in Shemitah. But on the label, it said the wine was produced for export after biur. You will find all these kind of labels in Shemitah, not early in the 7th year, but late in the 7th year or in the 8th year. You'll find wines that say on it, Otzer based in. You'll find wines that say on it, Otzer based in for export after biur. So these halachas will come together, Otzer based in, biur, and part of that label, export after biur, is going to be something we're going to study about today in the Mishnah. We're not going to fully understand the label. It was a label on a bottle of wine. It came from all the way up north, I believe from Ramat HaGolan, and it was produced under Rav Auerbach's. It was bottled under Rav Auerbach's Otzer based in for export after Biur. Now we're ready to start learning the Mishnah. Perek Vav, Mishnah Aleph. We're on page 454 of the Mishnah Behira. We're going to be learning about different areas in Eretz Yisrael. There are so many different shittas about where these exact cities are that it's impossible for us to go into the maps and show where these cities are because there's all kinds of shittas about where these cities are. What we're going to do is just get the basic concepts for now so that we understand how Eretz Yisrael is split into three places. Second introduction after Biur. We mentioned last time, at the end of last week when we were learning Shviis, the Jewish people left Mitzrayim on the 15th day of Nisan, Pesach, the 15th day of Nisan in the year 2448. Because of the unfortunate Chet Hamaraglim, they remained in the desert for 40 years. So you add 40 to 2448 and you're at 2488. In the year 2488, on the 10th day of Nisan, in the year 2488, the Jewish people crossed into Eretz Yisrael with Yoshua ben Nun. That crossing into Eretz Yisrael by the Jewish people with Yoshua ben Nun is called Kedusha Rishona, the very first sanctification of Eretz Yisrael. There are shittas that hold that there was a prior sanctification by Avraham Avinu. We're not going according to that shitta. Most shittas don't hold like that, and that's not the way we understand the Gemara. The Gemara in numerous places talks about Kedusha Rishona, the first sanctification of Eretz Yisrael, and Kedusha Shniya, the second sanctification of Eretz Yisrael. Kedusha Shlishis, we don't need to go into. We're going to be talking about Kedusha Rishona and Kedusha Shniya. When we talk about this area of Kedusha, we're not talking about the inherent holiness of Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is God's chosen place on earth, and He gave it to Klal Yisrael. Its inherent Kedusha remains. It's Kadosh. The question that we're going to be dealing with is halachic Kedusha. Halachic Kedusha means the halacha says that because Eretz Yisrael has halachic Kedusha, you take off Truma, Meiser, Peya, there's the mitzvah of Leket Shikha, there is the mitzvah of Shemitah. If a place is not halachic Eretz Yisrael, it doesn't have the rules of Truma, Meiser, Shemitah, the way we're accustomed to them. It may have a different level. So when we're going to be talking about Kedusha, sanctity, we're not talking about the inherent sanctity that God gave it, Eretz Yisrael. We're talking about the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael that triggers certain mitzvahs. Yoshua comes into Eretz Yisrael on the 10th day of Nisan in the year 2488. That's the first sanctification of Eretz Yisrael. That sanctification remains for how many years? The Jews entered Eretz Yisrael in 2488. The pasuk in Malachim says that the Jewish people, Shlomo HaMelech, built the first Beis HaMikdash 480 years after the Jews left Mitzrayim. Again, the Jews left Mitzrayim 480 years after they left Mitzrayim. Shlomo built the first Beis HaMikdash. Of that 480 years, 40 was spent in the desert because of the Chet HaMaraglim. So from the time Yoshua crossed the Yarden with the Jewish people and sanctified Eretz Yisrael for the first time, there's 440 years until the first Beis Hamikdash is built. There's 480 from the time they left Mitzrayim until the time they built the first Beis Hamikdash. 40 of the 480 are spent in the desert. They cross the Yarden and they build the Beis Hamikdash 440 years after they crossed the Yarden. How long did the first Beis Hamikdash stand? 410 years. That means that from the time Yoshua crossed the Jordan, 440 years later, they built the first Beis Hamikdash. First Beis Hamikdash stands for 410. 440 plus 410 is 850. From the time Yoshua crosses the Jordan River with the Jewish people for the first time and sanctifies Eretz Yisrael by coming in and conquering Eretz Yisrael, 850 years later, the first Beis Hamikdash is destroyed. And with the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, the quote-unquote halachic sanctity of Eretz Yisrael comes to an end. So if you're living in Eretz Yisrael, if you are a Jew who was left in Eretz Yisrael during the 70 years of Golus Bavel, during the 70 years of exile, Eretz Yisrael, again, we're talking about the most superficial level of discussion about this issue. There are multitudes of Shitas, but Kedusha Rishona, Kitsha L'Shaita, V'lo Kitsha L'Asad Lova. We're going to soon see a very interesting Rambam about this. It was sent out as a handout. After 8, Yoshua crosses the Yarden, sanctifies Eretz Yisrael, and at certain points, Truma kicks in, Meiser kicks in, Chala, Shemitah. These kick in after a certain amount of years after Yoshua crosses the Yarden. 850 years after he crosses the Yarden, the halachic kedusha ceases. So if a Jew was left in Eretz Yisrael during the 70 years of the Golus Bavel, he wouldn't have to take off Truma or Meiser. He didn't keep Shemitah because the halachic sanctity was not there. According to the sheet of Kedusha Rishona, Kitsha L'Shaita, V'lo Kitsha L'Asad Lova. The first sanctity placed by Yoshua in Eretz Yisrael was for only as long as the Jewish people remained in Eretz Yisrael. The first sanctity is Kedusha Rishona, Kitsha L'Shaita. It was for that time, V'lo L'Asad Lova, but not for the future. After the exile, there was no halachic trigger Kedusha in Eretz Yisrael. When Ezra came back with Jews to Eretz Yisrael, that's called Kedusha Shniya, the second sanctification of Eretz Yisrael in the days of Ezra. However, when the Jews came back in the days of Ezra to Eretz Yisrael, they didn't take over all of Eretz Yisrael. They only took over certain parts of Eretz Yisrael, but the borders of Eretz Yisrael, the halachic Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, was smaller than the halachic Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael from the time of Yoshua. Yoshua conquered a piece of land, not just Yoshua. Yoshua split the land, but over years, a large piece of Eretz Yisrael was conquered, not the full biblical Eretz Yisrael, but a good portion of Eretz Yisrael was conquered, and it all had halachic Kedusha. When the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, all the kedusha is gone. We'll see the Rambam in a moment, and it doesn't come back until Ezra brings back Jews into Eretz Yisrael. But the sanctity, the halachic sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, is only in those parts that Ezra took back and set up Jewish communities in. They did not set up Jewish communities in that large area that Yoshua conquered. They set up Jewish communities in a much smaller area. That smaller area is called Kedusha Shniya, the second sanctification. Let's just read the Mishnah, and then we're going to go to the Rambam to get an understanding of basically what we just said, the first sanctification versus the second sanctification. And the Rambam has a svara there that the Ravad doesn't really agree with. And this is a famous machlokes Rambam and Ravad. We'll take a look at it as far as we can get today. First, let's just read the Mishnah. Page 454. Shalosh aratzos l'shvius. There are three different lands, three different places, halachically speaking, when we deal with Shemitah in Eretz Yisrael. Kol shehechaziku ole bovel. All parts of Eretz Yisrael that were retaken by those who came back from Bovel, meaning those who were Aliyas Ezra, that's Kedusha Shniya, they came back with Ezra. What parts of Eretz Yisrael have halachic sanctity? May Eretz Yisrael v'ad Kaziv, from Eretz Yisrael, in other words, from the south, all the way up north to Kaziv. If you want to take a look at page 454, they're showing you a map which has Gavul Ole Mitzrayim. It's both parts. Okay, this is Gavul Ole Mitzrayim. From south all the way up north, a large part of Eretz Yisrael is conquered by those who left Mitzrayim. After the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash by Bavel, there's 70 years where there's, again, no Kedusha, halachic Kedusha. Then come back the Ole Bavel, and they conquer this area. And you can see that the area that they conquer ends here. And basically that's where Kaziv, if you look at Kaziv here, there's a city called Kaziv or an area called Kaziv. That's as far north as the people who came back from Bavel resettled. From south to Kaziv. Now notice the huge piece of land above Kaziv that the Jewish people did not settle when they came back from Bavel. And therefore that northern part above Kaziv does not have halachic sanctity for purposes of Shviis. We'll soon see what that means. So the first rule is we're splitting Eretz Yisrael into three concepts. Shalosh haratzos l'shvius. Kol shehachziku ole bavel me'eretz Yisrael v'ad Kaziv. All the area that those who came back from Bavel with Ezra, the Kedusha Shniya, the second sanctification, from the south. Now, what does south mean? Well, south means a very big shaila, and we're going to leave that as well. When we get to the halachic portion of learning through Shviis, we'll deal with that a lot, above a lot, all kinds of issues where south is. We're talking about the south that was settled by the Ole Bavel. And then there's the issue whether there are certain parts in the south were ever part of Eretz Yisrael. So there are two questions when you go all the way down south. Was this ever part of biblical Eretz Yisrael? And if it was part of biblical Eretz Yisrael, was it resettled by Ezra? If it wasn't resettled by Ezra, it may be biblically Eretz Yisrael, but it doesn't have halachic kedusha. So that's going to be a shaila. How far down south, A, is biblical Eretz Yisrael? There are parts all the way down south that may be chutz la'aretz altogether. And then, even if it's Eretz Yisrael, is it an area that was resettled by Ezra? So the Mishnah says, "May Eretz Yisrael v'ad Kaziv," from south Eretz Yisrael all the way north to Kaziv, and that's it. Lo ne'echal v'lo ne'evad. Let's read the second words first. Lo ne'evad. You cannot work the fields, you cannot work the ground in this area from south all the way to Kaziv. That's the area where Ezra resettled Eretz Yisrael, and therefore he gave it the second sanctity, Kedusha Shniya, and the second sanctity means that it has a biblical sanctity. And I use the word biblical in quote marks for now, because that's going to lead to another machlokas, okay? we're really getting into this parak, we're getting into many, many fundamental questions about halachic shmita that's nogeya today. Which parts of Eretz Yisrael today do you have to keep shmita? So people raise their eyebrows and say, what do you mean? There's places in Eretz Yisrael that you don't have to keep shmita? Take it easy, be patient, biblical, rabbinic, what parts? These are all going to be questions that are going to be nogeya us in how we keep shmita today. So first we get the concepts. From South Eretz Yisrael, wherever that is, until Kaziv, lo ne'evat. You cannot work that area. That has the biblical, quote unquote, kedusha of Shemitah. I say biblical, quote unquote, because we have the new question. Is Shemitah today a biblical requirement or a rabbinic requirement? And that's an overlay to all of Hilchos Shemitah. This already is a machlokes in the Gemara between Rebbe and the Chachamim, whether Shemitah today, all the way back then, in the days of Rebbe and the Chacham, whether Shemitah is a biblical requirement or rabbinic requirement. And you can imagine the vast difference. If we're dealing with a biblical requirement, there's very little room for kula, for leniency. If we're dealing with rabbinic law, there's more room for leniency. When we keep Shemitah today, according to the Rambam, according to Maimonides, the way he paskins, Shemitah today is of pure rabbinic nature. Ramban Nachmanides rules that Shemitah today is of biblical, remains biblical. And so we have Rambam, Maimonides, rabbinic, Ramban Nachmanides, biblical, and of course the difference in halacha is vast. Most poskim today, not just today, but all the way back, but certainly today, Chazon Ish, hold like the Rambam, that we keep Shemitah today in the areas where you have to keep Shemitah, it's of rabbinic nature. Okay. So from South Eretz Yisrael until Kaziv, north, if you look at the map on page 454, Kaziv is slightly above Akko. There is even a machlokes if the Akko today is the Akko that the Chazal talked about. Is it the same Akko? So you can already see we're dealing with machlokes on top of machlokes on top of machlokes. Where exactly is Kaziv? And from South Eretz Yisrael to Kaziv, I have to keep Shemitah. Is that biblical or is that rabbinic? Okay. So there's going to be a lot of questions here. Just let's get concepts. When Ezra came, they settled from south, we don't know exactly where for now, all the way north to Kaziv. That area, lo nevad, you cannot work in that area, it's Shemitah. According to Nachmanides, you can't work that area biblically. According to Maimonides, you can't work that area rabbinically. First rule, lo ne'echal, and you can't eat from that area. What does you can't eat from that area mean? So we're going to take a look in the Rav, and this is where beer comes from. Page 455, the left-hand column at the top. Okay, right here in your Mishnah Behira. Okay, right here. Pirish Acher V'ikur. The Rabbeinu Ovadia Bar Knur says the real pshat in this Mishnah, lo necha la'acha Shviis below bi'ur lo nevad b'shviis. When the Mishnah says lo ne'echal, it means that if a person has a field, a pomegranate field, between southern Eretz Yisrael and Kaziv, and people picked from his pomegranate tree, And using our example before, the 20th day of Av came and he still has pomegranates in his house, you must take the pomegranates out of your house and be mafkir them, do the biur mitzvah. If you don't do the biur mitzvah, you cannot eat from those pomegranates. So therefore, in this area that was resettled by Ezra, which is from South Eretz Yisrael, where we don't know yet, all the way north to Kaziv, any area between there, you can't work your field, Maimonides rabbinically, Nachmanides biblically, and there's a mitzvah of biur in the area from southern Eretz Yisrael to Kaziv. So if the scheduled deadline comes for the pomegranates and you still have pomegranates in your house, and it was collected between southern Eretz Yisrael and Kaziv, there's a mitzvah biur, take them out of your house and be mafkir them. If you don't do the mitzvah of biur, you cannot eat those fruits. Step one. There's a halacha. What do we do after the churban of the second Beis Hamikdash? We talked about Kiddush Rishona, the first sanctification of Eretz Yisrael when Yoshua came into Eretz Yisrael in the year 2488. And that halachic sanctification came to an end with the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash. 70 years later, Ezra comes back to Eretz Yisrael. It's really a little more than that, but there was already Olei Bavel. When the Olei Bavel come back to Eretz Yisrael, there's the second sanctification. Okay, and that second sanctification for halachic sanctification is for Shemitah, southern Eretz Yisrael until Kaziv in the north. Okay. What happened when the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed? Did Eretz Yisrael in that part from southern Eretz Yisrael to Kaziv, did it lose its sanctification? The answer is no, because Kedusha Shniya Kidsha L'Shaita V'Kidsha L'Asid Lava. The halacha is that the second sanctification done by Ezra was eternal, so that the areas that Ezra and the people that came with him sanctified in Eretz Yisrael, and that was a process how they did it, and they sanctified a certain area from southern Eretz Yisrael to Kaziv. When the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the halachic sanctity remained in that area. So therefore, there's an area in Eretz Yisrael that continues to have halachic sanctity for Shemitah, going all the way back to the days of Ezra. Where is that area? Southern Eretz Yisrael to Kaziv. What about outside that area? So we're going to take a look at the rest of the Mishnah now. Again, the overlay. Rambam, Maimonides, biblical Shemitah. Nachmanides, Ramban, rabbinic Shemitah. So that's the first concept of Eretz Yisrael, the place that was resettled by Ezra. In that area, there's real Shemitah. You cannot work the ground, and when biur comes, you have to be mafkir the peiros. Second, page 455, V'chol shehechaziku olei Mitzrayim, and Eretz Yisrael that was taken by the people who came from Mitzrayim. They came with Yoshua. That's the first sanctification. Mikziv, going to page 457, Mikziv va'ad hanahor va'ad almona ne'echal avalo neva. But the area basically outside Kaziv, if you go further north than Kaziv, if you go back to page 454, the picture, and you go further north than Kaziv, you see at the top of the picture on page 454, there's a place called Amana, and that's where the Mishnah is referring to on page 457. Mikaziv ad hanahor ad Amana, from Kaziv until the Nahar, the river, and until Ammona up north. Again, where these exact places are is a big machlokes. If you want to take a look, you can take a look at page 456. There's another map. This is the sheet of the Eretz Chemda. It shows you the three different demarcations. For right now, you don't have to look at Syria. Syria will be the next mission. But once you go further north, to the east, to the west, you go further north than Keziv, Ne'echal, then you don't have to keep Biur. If you have pomegranates in your house after the 20th of Av, and you collected those pomegranates from a pomegranate tree that's further north than Keziv, you can eat it after the Biur time. You do not have to do the mitzvah of Biur, Avalon never. But rabbinically, you cannot work the area. This is an area that those who came from Mitzrayim with Yoshua, they sanctified it. But with the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash 850 years later, it lost its halachic sanctity. When Ezra came back and resettled Eretz Yisrael, they didn't resettle that far north. Therefore, Chachamim made a middle ground here. Because this is an area that those who left Mitzrayim sanctified, we're not just going to give it a rule of Chutz La'aretz, we're going to give it a middle ground rule. This is all rabbinic, because once Ezra didn't settle it, it didn't get halachic sanctity. But we gave it, the Chachamim gave it a sanctity of a certain level. Don't work the ground in the seventh year north of Keziv, but the fruits that grow on the tree that have Kedusha Shviis north of Keziv, you don't have to do the mitzvah of Biur. And in our example, on the 20th of Av, you can keep the pomegranates in your house and eat them. So this is sort of like a middle level that they did for the northern part of Eretz Yisrael past Keziv. So this becomes a question of where is Keziv? Where is the Golan? Where is the Ramat HaGolan? Okay, for all intent and purposes, the Ramat HaGolan is north of Keziv, and therefore, theoretically, we're not paskening any shilas here because we don't know where these exact places are. But in theory, if we assume Ramat HaGolan is further north than Keziv, then we're in the second halacha. You cannot work the ground in Shemitah in Ramat HaGolan, but fruits that grow in Ramat HaGolan, they are Shemitah fruits. There are grapes growing in Ramat HaGolan that blossomed in the seventh year. And they are Shviis fruits. They grew in the seventh year. You don't have to keep the mitzvah of Biur, and after the Biur scheduled date comes, you can continue to eat from those grapes. No Biur. But you wouldn't work that land. Third idea, min hanahar ume'amona v'lefnim nechal v'nevad. The Rav explains that now we're talking about it shouldn't be lefnim, it should be lechutz. If you go even further than Amana, you take a look in picture, the picture on page 454. Amana is very far north past Keziv. If you go past Amana, then if you're living in that area during Shemitah, you can work the land there and you don't have to keep Biur there. That for us is Chutz La'aretz. So we have three places that are three rules that are Nageya for us today. The place that were those areas in Eretz Yisrael that were sanctified when Ezra came, and that's called Kedusha Shniya, the second sanctification, that took hold permanently. Kedusha Shniya Kitchel Shaita V'Kitchel Asad Lavo, the area settled by the Olei Bavel with Ezra, was sanctified permanently. And therefore, in that area from southern Eretz Yisrael to Keziv, You have to keep Shemitah. You cannot eat after the biur, and you can't work the ground. Whether these are Shemitah rules biblically or Shemitah rules rabbinically, we mentioned is a machlokas between Nachmanides and Maimonides. Nevertheless, from southern Eretz Yisrael, wherever that is, until Keziv, we have the first level of Shemitah. Don't work the ground, and you must keep the mitzvah of biur. If you go further north from Keziv and you go to Ammona, that's an area that was conquered by those who came from Mitzrayim with Yoshua. So at one point in time, it had biblical Kedusha, halachic Kedusha, until the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. When the Jews came back with Ezra, the Shemitah was from southern Eretz Yisrael till Keziv for all purposes. From Keziv north to Ammona, you can't work the field, but you don't have to keep biur. And even further north than Ammona, for our purposes as Chutz La'aretz, you can work the field and you don't have to keep biur. That's really, I know it took us almost 45 minutes to do that today, but that's basically almost just a summary of the concepts that this Mishnah is teaching us. Where are all these places? Big machlokes, but we have the concept. And for us today, we are living in the halachic sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, based upon the parts of Eretz Yisrael that were sanctified by Ezra when he came in Aliyah Shniya, when he came with the Kedusha Shniya. He re-sanctified Eretz Yisrael, and we live under the sanctification done by Ezra when he came back after the 70 years of Golus Bavel. That area sanctified was southern Eretz Yisrael, wherever that is for now, until Keziv. In that area, we have the Shemitah. You cannot work the field, and you have to make sure you observe the rules of biur. And for our purposes, that's the area today that remains sanctified for Shemitah. What about outside that area? From Keziv until Ammona, you can't work the land, but there's no biur. Past Ammona is Chutz La'aretz. What do we do practically today about keeping Shemitah in the north or very far down in the south? Everybody's going to have to be patient about how different poskim treat all the way down south or all the way up north. But as I mentioned earlier, Arthur Jacobs sent me a picture of a label, and I believe it's Ramat HaGolan wine under the Otzer, based in a different discussion of Rav Auerbach Shlita, and it says for export after biur. For export creates a problem. We're going to learn that you're not allowed to take Peirish Shviis to Chutz La'aretz. You're not allowed to send them to Chutz La'aretz. We've talked about it. We're going to learn more about it. You can't take Peirish Shviis to Chutz La'aretz. Here we have a case where the Otzer Beis Din put on the label for export after biur. So let's take this very simplistically. If this wine, I think, was Ramat HaGolan, and let's assume for now Ramat HaGolan is further north than Keziv. If it's further north than Keziv, what does that tell you? You can't work the land in the Ramat HaGolan, but there's no mitzvah biur. Once the scheduled biur comes for grapes, you can continue eating the grapes. And it doesn't have Kedusha Shvius according to some Shitas at that point. Therefore, after the biur, it may be permissible to export wine from Ramat HaGolan. These are all questions. Is Ramat HaGolan considered past Keziv? Can you export after biur? What's the effect of an Otzer Beis Din on all of these questions? So these are all good questions. We're going to get to them b'li neder, but we're beginning to see how all these questions actually become halakhically relevant today. You'll go into the supermarket, or you may even have in your house still from the last Shemitah. You go into the supermarket after this Shemitah, and you're going to find wines that have on it the label Otzer Basin, Biur, all kinds of words on the label. And in Mi'at Hashem, we started getting understanding of these concepts and why they're relevant even today. Okay, b'li neder, next time we learn Shviis, which I believe is Wednesday, we'll take a look at the Rambam. So it's there, it was sent out. We'll be able to take a look at the Rambam.